How did ancient humans survive earthquakes? You feel your building shake for 2 seconds, maybe from a truck outside, maybe from nothing at all, and your first instinct is to check your phone to see if it was actually an earthquake. Ancient humans standing on the exact same ground never got that confirmation. When the shaking didn't stop after 2 seconds, there was no phone to check and no walls engineered to protect them, only open ground that was suddenly no longer solid and no way of knowing whether the next second would be worse than the last one. So, how did a species that had trusted the earth beneath its feet for its entire existence survive the one event that took that trust away without any warning at all? It wasn't strength. It wasn't a shelter built to withstand it. Not for most of human history. It was something closer to instinct, buried in your own nervous system right now, and something ancient communities eventually learned to read in the ground, and in each other's stories, and in whatever they'd built with their own hands, long before the worst of it ever arrived. Here is something your phone's earthquake alert is quietly built on. A big earthquake actually sends out two different waves, and the faster one, called a P wave, arrives first as a low rumble, seconds before the slower, much more violent S wave hits and the real shaking begins. Modern seismographs detect that first wave and fire off a warning before the destructive part even reaches you. Ancient humans had no seismograph, but some appear to have noticed a similar pattern with nothing but their own senses. In 1975, officials in Haicheng, China ordered a mass evacuation, partly based on reports of unusual animal behavior in the days before a major quake struck, and the city's death toll was a fraction of what it could have been. Scientists still don't fully agree on how reliable animal behavior actually is as a warning sign, and plenty of quakes have arrived with no unusual behavior reported at all. But the pattern has surfaced often enough across enough separate cultures with no contact between them that it is hard to dismiss outright as coincidence. The moment the ground actually starts moving, your body reacts before your conscious mind even catches up. Adrenaline floods your system, your heart rate spikes, and your muscles prepare to either run or freeze completely. The same fight or flight response that would have fired in a hunter-gatherer's body the first time solid ground betrayed them. The difference is that response evolved to deal with a predator you could see and outrun. It was never built for a threat with no direction, no shape, no smell, and nowhere obvious to run toward, which is part of why an earthquake can feel more frightening in the moment than a threat that is actually far more likely to kill you. For most of human history, before permanent buildings existed at all, an earthquake meant something different than it does now. There was no roof to collapse onto you. The real danger was the ground itself splitting, rock slides breaking loose from cliffs above a camp, panic spreading instantly through a group that had never once needed to doubt whether the earth would hold. Your entire sense of balance depends on your inner ear trusting that the ground beneath you is fixed. When that assumption breaks, even for a few seconds, it triggers something closer to pure disorientation than ordinary fear, and that reaction is still wired into you exactly the same way it was wired into them. Here is the part nobody tells you about checking your phone after a quake. You are running the exact same threat assessment your ancestors ran with nothing but their own senses, just with slightly better information. You want to know if it is over, so did they. The only difference is how long you have to wait for the answer. Once humans started building permanent settlements, the danger changed shape entirely, and in some places it may have changed the entire course of history. Stanford geophysicist Amos Noor has spent decades studying something he calls an earthquake storm, a cluster of major quakes striking the same region across a few decades, and he argues one such storm may have struck the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean around 1200 BC. Excavations at cities like Troy, Mycenae, and Megiddo show multiple layers of sudden destruction stacked on top of each other, and Noor's theory suggests earthquake damage may have helped trigger the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilization across the entire region. It remains a genuinely debated idea among archaeologists, not a settled fact, but the destruction layers themselves are real and excavated, sitting exactly where those cities once stood. Somewhere else on the planet, with no writing system at all, a different group of ancient humans solved the exact same problem in a completely different way. Along the Pacific coast of North America, indigenous communities passed down a story for generations about a great battle between a thunderbird and a whale, a fight so violent it shook the ground and pulled the ocean itself into a towering wave. Oral histories from that region describe people tying their canoes to treetops as the water rose, a detail that sounds almost mythical until you realize it was practical advice disguised as legend. For nearly 300 years, nobody outside those communities knew the story described a real event. Then, geologists matched tree ring dates from drowned forests in the Pacific Northwest to written records in Japan describing a tsunami with no local earthquake to explain it, arriving on the 27th of January, 1700. Researcher Kenji Satake and colleagues realized the wave had crossed the entire Pacific Ocean, and the earthquake that caused it was the very one the Thunderbird story had been describing the whole time. You come from ancestors who wrote survival information into a story so it would survive even without paper, and it worked for 3 centuries. For the people actually living through moments like that, the shelter they had built to protect themselves from everything else — wind, rain, predators, enemies — suddenly became the exact thing trying to kill them. Mud brick walls that had stood for generations came down in seconds, on top of the same families they had sheltered every night before that one. What came after the shaking mattered just as much as the shaking itself. Entire communities digging through rubble by hand for survivors, sharing whatever food and water hadn't been buried, because there was no other option, and no one coming to help from outside. Some ancient societies solved the building problem directly instead of leaving it to luck. In the Peruvian Andes, Inca stonemasons cut massive blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, so precisely that they interlocked without a drop of mortar. When the ground shook, those walls didn't crack. They danced, shifting slightly against each other and settling right back into place once the tremors passed. Centuries later, Spanish colonial buildings constructed right alongside those same walls collapsed in earthquake after earthquake, while the original Inca stonework kept standing underneath them, then and now. Nobody needed a physics degree to figure that out. They needed generations of watching what survived and what didn't, and building the next wall accordingly. Right now, if your walls started shaking, building codes and steel reinforcement are doing quiet, invisible work that Inca engineers had already puzzled out by hand, centuries earlier, one interlocking stone at a time. Nobody in Troy or Megiddo had that working in their favor. They just had whatever the builders before them happened to guess correctly, and hoped it held. Here is what nobody tells you about surviving something like that, though. It wasn't really about the shaking itself. Most earthquake deaths, then and now, come from what falls afterward, not from the ground moving. Ancient communities that survived the worst quakes weren't the ones who stood the stillest. They were the ones who got out from under anything that could fall on them, fast before the second wave of shaking even arrived, and the ones who remembered what to do next because someone had told them a story about it. And that pattern hasn't gone away just because we have warnings now. Earthquakes remain one of the deadliest natural disasters humans face, capable of killing more people in a single afternoon than most other disasters manage in an entire year. The 2010 earthquake in Haiti and the 2023 earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria each killed tens of thousands of people, mostly from buildings collapsing on top of them in communities where the ground had felt solid every single day right up until the moment it wasn't. Survivors of both those quakes described sleeping outside for weeks afterward, in tents, in cars, in open fields, too afraid of aftershocks to trust a roof again, which is exactly the same instinct your ancestors were following long before anyone called it that or studied it in a lab. So somehow, generation after generation on every inhabited continent, enough of your ancestors made it through this exact kind of moment for you to exist at all. Not the ones who built the strongest walls, necessarily, and not the ones who prayed the hardest, either. The ones who paid attention, who noticed the animals go quiet, who told their children a story about a bird and a whale, who fit one stone against another until it could move without breaking. Not because they stopped being afraid when the ground moved. They never did, and neither will you. But because something in them, and now in you, has always known what to do in the instant the one surface you've never doubted stops being trustworthy, if only for a few seconds. So the next time you feel that first small tremor and reach for your phone to check if it was real, remember that you are running a threat assessment your ancestors ran with nothing but their own bodies and each other's stories on the same shaking ground, thousands of years before anyone built a wall that could fall on them. You come from survivors.
How did ancient humans survive deadly winters?
You wake up because your blanket slipped off your shoulder. Just an inch, just enough for the cold to find the gap. You pull it back up without even opening your eyes. It's automatic. Your body solved the problem before your brain even clocked there was one. 40,000 years ago, that same inch of exposed skin was the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. Think about how casually you treat cold right now. You glance at your phone, see the temperature, and decide whether a jacket is worth it. You complain when the thermostat dips below 70 like it's a personal insult. And somewhere underneath all that complaining is a body that still remembers, on some deep cellular level, what it actually means to be cold with nowhere warm to go. You just haven't had to use that memory in a long time. Ice Age humans did not have that luxury. Around 24,000 years ago, during what archaeologists call the last glacial maximum, temperatures across Ice Age Europe dropped hard enough that entire ecosystems reorganized around the cold. At a site called Kammern-Grubgraben in Austria, researchers found something strange sitting in the same layer as caribou bones, eyed sewing needles. Not awls for punching holes, actual needles built for pulling thread through tight seams. Before this period, sites in the same region show a much wider range of animal remains and no needles like these at all. Something changed, the cold got worse, and the humans living through it changed with it. Here's the part that should mess with you a little. For a long time, archaeologists assumed Ice Age technology was mostly about food. Bigger spears, better traps, smarter hunting. But Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist at the University of Sydney who studies prehistoric clothing, has pointed out that staying warm may have mattered just as much as staying fed. You can have all the calories in the world and still die shivering in a cave if nothing is stopping the heat from leaving your body. Warmth wasn't a side project. It was survival infrastructure, as real and as urgent as food. Picture the version of this you actually know. You leave the house without a coat because the app said it wouldn't be that bad, and within 20 minutes you're regretting every decision that led you to this moment. Arms crossed, hunched over, silently begging for a building to walk into. Now stretch that feeling out, not 20 minutes, months. No building to walk into, no app, no forecast, nothing but sky and instinct telling you a storm is coming, and you'd better already be ready for it, because readiness is not something you can improvise once the cold has already arrived. So they got ready. On the other side of the world, at a site called La Prille in what's now Wyoming, archaeologists digging almost 5 meters underground found 32 needle fragments made from animal bone, buried alongside the remains of a butchered mammoth. Using protein analysis on the bone collagen, researchers led by Spencer Pelton were able to figure out for the first time exactly what kind of animals those needles came from. Foxes, hares, bobcats, even the now extinct American cheetah. Small, thin, straight bones, chosen deliberately because they made better needles than anything you could carve from something bigger. That is not guesswork. That is not luck. That is someone sitting there, cold, thinking carefully about which animal's leg bone sews best. And once you have needles like that, you don't just wrap yourself in a hide anymore. You tailor it. You cut it to fit the actual shape of your body, seal the seams tight enough that wind can't sneak through, layer it the way a modern parka is layered, because it turns out humans figured out the parka logic a very long time before anyone called it that. Gilligan has argued that tight-sewn clothing like this may be exactly what let humans push into places they physically could not have survived in before, territory that was simply off-limits to a species wearing loosely draped skins. It wasn't only culture doing the work either. Some of it may have been baked into the body itself. Neanderthals, who lived across cold parts of Europe and Western Asia for a very long time before disappearing, had short, stocky limbs and barrel-shaped chests, a build that shows up again and again in cold climate mammals because it holds heat in more efficiently than a taller, leaner frame. Researchers studying this pattern, sometimes called Bergmann's and Allen's rules, point out that a compact body loses less warmth relative to its size. The same reason a basketball cools down slower than a tennis ball. It's a tidy explanation, and also a genuinely contested one. Some anthropologists think Neanderthal build really was shaped by cold. Others argue it just as easily could have come from a high-activity lifestyle, tough terrain, or hormonal patterns in growth, and that untangling one cause from the others may not even be possible with the evidence available. Nobody's pretending this one is settled. What both sides agree on is that surviving Ice Age winters wasn't only a matter of what you wore or where you slept. On some level, it may have shaped what your body looked like in the first place. Sewn clothing this old is hard to prove directly because hide and fiber rot away long before bone does. But in 2026, researchers led by Samantha Rosenkrantz reported what may be the oldest known sewn clothing ever found. Pieces of animal hide stitched together with braided cords, pulled from a cave in Oregon and dated to roughly 12,000 years ago, right at the tail end of the last ice age. The word may matters there. It's a strong candidate, not a closed case, and the researchers themselves are careful about that distinction. Still, even as a candidate, it fits the same pattern showing up everywhere else in this story. Cold pushes people towards stitching, and stitching pushes people towards surviving places they couldn't have survived unclothed. Now, go back to that gap in your blanket, that inch of cold air finding the one weak point in your defenses. That's the same problem at a smaller scale that a sewn seam was solving 40,000 years ago. The difference is you fix yours in your sleep without waking up. They fixed theirs with a bone needle, sinew thread, and hours of work by firelight, because getting it wrong wasn't an inconvenience. It was the whole gamble. Clothing wasn't the only answer. Shelter had to hold up its end, too. In central Ukraine, at a site called Mezhirish, archaeologists uncovered circular structures built almost entirely out of mammoth bones. Skulls, ribs, tusks, stacked and arranged into a frame, then likely covered with hides for insulation. Recent radiocarbon work led by Wei Chu at Leiden University dated one of these structures to the harshest phase of the last ice age, and found evidence that it may have been used on and off across several centuries. Whether that means one family kept coming back generation after generation, or something closer to a shared seasonal shelter reused by different groups, is genuinely still debated among archaeologists. What isn't debated is the engineering. Some of those mammoth bones weighed hundreds of pounds. Someone chose to haul that weight, piece by piece, into a shape specifically designed to block wind and hold heat, because a pile of bones left randomly on the ground does nothing. Arranged correctly, it becomes a wall between you and dying. You've probably pictured a caveman freezing in a snowdrift somewhere, teeth chattering, barely hanging on. That image is basically wrong. It's the comfortable version, the one where surviving the ice age looks like blind luck and gritted teeth. The real version is closer to engineering, tailored clothing built from carefully chosen bones, shelters built from literal mammoths stacked with intention, fires kept burning through the night, tended in shifts, because letting a fire die in the middle of a common grub in winter wasn't a minor mistake, it was the kind of mistake you didn't get to make twice. And there's a piece of this that's easy to miss because it doesn't leave artifacts behind the way needles and bones do. They weren't doing any of this alone. Bodies sleeping close together share heat. A group tending one fire uses less fuel per person than a dozen scattered fires ever could, which means every extra person crowded into a mammoth bone hut wasn't just company, it was thermal insurance. Someone almost certainly had to wake up in the freezing middle of the night to feed the fire, over and over, night after night, all winter, because a fire that goes out at 3 in the morning doesn't wait politely for someone to notice in the morning. It just goes out and the cold walks straight in behind it. Survival wasn't just clothing and shelter, it was proximity, and it was vigilance. It was choosing night after night to stay close enough to someone else and awake enough at the worst hour that neither of you froze. You do a version of the first part too, whether you think about it that way or not. Every time you'd rather share a blanket than sleep cold and alone. You just don't have to do the second part anymore. Somebody, a very long time ago, effectively did your fire tending for you by surviving long enough to pass down every trick that made fire tending unnecessary for you specifically. So the next time your blanket slips an inch and your hand finds it without you even waking up, sit with that for a second. That reflex is old. Older than cities, older than farming, older than almost anything you'd call civilization. It was shaped by winters that killed people who got it wrong and spared the ones who didn't, generation after generation, until the ones who were left were the ones whose bodies simply would not let a gap in the blanket go unnoticed. You come from the ones who noticed.
How did ancient humans survive volcanic eruptions?
Right now, if you smelled something sharp and rotten in the air outside your house, sulfur, like a struck match that never faded, you'd probably pull out your phone and search it before doing anything else. Somewhere around 3,500 years ago, on a small volcanic island in the Aegean Sea, a Bronze Age city called Akrotiri emptied out completely, right before the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history buried it under 60 meters of ash. Archaeologists have excavated the entire site. They've found frescoes, multi-story homes, indoor plumbing, storage jars still full of food like the owners meant to come back. What they have never found, not once in decades of digging, is a body. Somehow, an entire Bronze Age population read the warning signs correctly and got out in time with no seismograph, no news alert, nothing but their own senses. And to this day, nobody fully agrees on how. That mystery sits at the center of one of the strangest survival stories in human history. And it's not even the only time ancient people faced down a volcano and somehow came out the other side. 4 different groups of ancient humans lived through real volcanic catastrophe, and the empty island is the one nobody can fully explain. So keep it in mind because you're coming back to it. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano called Toba produced an eruption so massive it's still considered one of the 2 largest in the last 2 million years, roughly 5,000 times bigger than Mount St. Helens in 1980. For decades, the leading theory said this single event nearly wiped out our entire species, plunging the planet into a volcanic winter that lasted up to a decade and crashing the global human population down to a few thousand individuals. A bottleneck some scientists still think you can see written into the DNA of every person alive today. It's a genuinely dramatic story. It's also, according to a growing pile of archaeological evidence, probably wrong, or at least badly overstated. Scientists traced Toba's reach using something called cryptotephra, microscopic shards of volcanic glass invisible to the naked eye that carry the eruption's exact chemical signature wherever the wind carried them. Sift through the right layer of dirt at the right dig site, and you can tell whether people were living there before the eruption, during it, and after. Sites in South Africa, Ethiopia, and India all tell the same story. The same stone tools, made the same way, showing up in the ground on both sides of the ash layer, completely unbothered by an event that supposedly should have nearly erased them. Humans didn't just survive Toba. In several places, they barely seem to have noticed. That's the kind of survival story you'd expect. Honestly, distance and dumb luck doing most of the work. It doesn't explain that empty city on the Greek island you started with, the one that had no distance to hide behind it all. But surviving a distant super eruption from thousands of miles away is one thing. Surviving one that erupts directly underneath you is something else entirely. About 7,700 years ago, in what's now Oregon, a mountain called Mazama did exactly that. The eruption was violent enough that the entire summit collapsed in on itself, leaving a hole in the earth that slowly filled with rain and snowmelt over the following centuries into what you now know as Crater Lake. Archaeologists have found sandals and other tools buried directly under the ash and pumice from that eruption, so we know for a fact that people were there when it happened. What's stranger is what happened after. The ancestors of the Klamath people turned the eruption into a story, a battle between Lau, the chief of the world below the mountain, and Skell, the chief of the sky, hurling fire and rock at each other across 100 miles until Lau fell back into the earth and left the hole that became the lake. That story was told out loud, generation after generation, with no writing system to preserve it. For 7,700 years, and it still lines up with what geologists can independently verify happened in the ground. You come from people who could encode a real volcanic disaster into folklore accurately enough that scientists, thousands of years later, could use the story as a research lead. That's not superstition. That's a working memory system that happened to run on voices instead of hard drives. But not every ancient eruption gave people that kind of time to process it into legend. Some gave people less than a day. On the 24th of August in the year 79, Mount Vesuvius erupted over the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And for a long time, the popular image of that disaster has been a city frozen mid-scream, caught completely by surprise. The real picture, according to recent research tracing family names on tombstones and public buildings in nearby towns, is more complicated and honestly, more impressive. Of Pompeii's roughly 20,000 residents, current estimates put the death toll at around 2,000, meaning the overwhelming majority of the city got out. For nearly 18 hours, ash and pumice the size of fists rained down while people made a brutal calculation in real time. Run now through the falling debris, or shelter and hope the roof holds, and thousands of them chose correctly and left before dawn, before the pyroclastic surges that finally buried everyone who stayed came racing down the mountain at more than 100 miles an hour. A classics professor named Stephen Tuck actually tracked where a lot of them went, cross-referencing distinctive Pompeian family names against records in nearby cities like Naples and Puteoli, and found families who not only survived, but rebuilt, prospered, and funded public buildings in their new hometowns. The people who died tended to be the ones who had the least ability to leave: the elderly, the very young, the enslaved, and the ones who went back for their belongings, or their family, one last time. At Herculaneum, closer to the mountain, around 300 people sheltering in boat chambers along the waterfront were killed almost instantly when a surge of ash and gas hotter than 500 degrees Celsius swept over them. A death so fast that researchers studying the remains found evidence of skulls fracturing from internal heat before the body had time to burn. Pompeii wasn't really a story about a city that got caught off guard. It was a story about who has the option to run and who doesn't, then and now. Which brings you back to that empty city on Akrotiri, the one that didn't lose a single confirmed life to one of the biggest eruptions in recorded history, and finally answers the question of how. Geologists studying the ash layers at Akrotiri found something specific. The earliest layer is thin, and shows almost no erosion from rain before the next layer was deposited on top of it, which tells you the gap between the first warning signs and the full eruption was probably weeks, maybe a few months, not years and not minutes. Long enough to notice something was wrong. Long enough to act on it. The city's residents left their gold behind. They left food stored in jars as if they planned to return. What they didn't leave behind were bodies, and the leading theory is that a run of earthquakes in the weeks before the eruption, the same kind of ground-shaking modern seismographs now pick up automatically, told an entire Bronze Age population everything it needed to know, and they trusted it enough to walk away from an entire city. They didn't have a monitoring station. They had attention, and each other, and enough shared memory of what a bad tremor usually meant to act on instinct before the mountain gave them any louder warning than that. Modern volcanology has essentially just formalized what Akrotiri's residents figured out with nothing but their own senses. Scientists now watch for the same handful of signs: clusters of small earthquakes, ground that swells and tilts as magma pushes upward underneath it, and shifts in the sulfur smell drifting off a volcano's vents. In April of 1991, small steam explosions started tearing open new cracks on the side of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, a mountain nobody had bothered to monitor closely because it had been quiet for 400 years. Scientists rushed in seismographs, watched the earthquakes climb, smelled the sulfur getting stronger, and started evacuating villages within days. By the time Pinatubo detonated in June, more than 75,000 people and an entire U.S. airbase were already gone. Thousands of lives and hundreds of millions of dollars were saved because a small team of people paid close attention to exactly the kind of signs a Bronze Age community somehow read correctly 36 centuries earlier with nothing but instinct and each other. Most of the 1,500 active volcanoes on Earth right now are watched far less closely than Pinatubo was. So the next time you catch a smell in the air that shouldn't be there, or feel the ground do something it normally doesn't, you're running the exact same threat assessment the people of Akrotiri ran with nothing but instinct, long before anyone built a seismograph to do it for them. Some of your ancestors read those signs perfectly and walked an entire city away from one of the worst eruptions in recorded history. Would you have caught it in time? Tell me what sign you think you'd have noticed first.
How did ancient humans survive months of rain?
You're stuck inside. Day 3 of rain. You've refreshed your phone 11 times in the last 10 minutes for absolutely no reason. You're bored out of your mind, mildly annoyed, and mostly just waiting for the sky to fix itself so you can go back outside like a normal person. Now imagine that boredom, except it's not day 3, it's day 31. There's no roof that actually works, no phone, no dry socks, And everyone you know is trapped in the same wet, smoky shelter with you, listening to the same dripping sound, hour after hour, for a month. So here's the question nobody really asks. What did ancient humans actually do when it rained for weeks straight? Because we love talking about how they survived predators. We love talking about how they survived the cold, the hunger, the occasional saber-toothed disagreement, but weeks of nonstop rain? That almost never comes up. And it should, because in a lot of ancient environments, that might have been the thing that quietly wore people down faster than anything with teeth. This isn't about a rainy afternoon, it's not about getting caught in a storm on the walk home. We're talking about entire seasons, sometimes months, where the sky simply didn't stop. Monsoon regions in South and Southeast Asia still experience this today, several straight months where rainfall is nearly constant. Now push that same climate pattern back 50, 100, 200,000 years onto people with no waterproof anything, and you start to see the actual scale of the problem. Let's start with the obvious one, fire. Fire is everything to early humans. Warmth, cooking, protection, light in the dark. And fire, as you probably know from that one miserable camping trip, does not love water. Keeping a fire alive through weeks of sustained rain wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a full-time survival job, arguably one of the most important jobs in the entire group. Let a fire die completely during a month-long storm, and you're not just cold for a night, you're potentially without cooked food, without dry warmth, and without the ability to see anything after dark for as long as the rain keeps you from starting a new one. Archaeological sites show early humans getting genuinely clever about this. Hearths built inside deep rock overhangs, positioned specifically to catch a fire's smoke and heat while keeping the actual flame shielded from a slanted downpour. Some sites show fires built on raised platforms of packed earth or stone, elevated just enough to survive flooding underfoot. Others show evidence of fire being carried and tended in shifts, never left unattended, almost like a small flame was being kept on life support around the clock for the length of an entire storm season. This wasn't luck. This was engineering, done by people with no blueprints, just several thousand years of watching fires die and figuring out why. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the rain problem, though. It's not really about being wet. Being wet is uncomfortable, sure, but it's not what kills you. What actually kills you is everything wet brings with it. Damp environments are a five-star resort for mold, bacteria, and respiratory illness. Stored food rots faster. Wounds that would normally heal start to fester. Wooden tools warp, hides stiffen and rot, and anything not carefully stored becomes useless within days. A month of rain isn't one long problem. It's dozens of smaller problems compounding on top of each other simultaneously, and every single one of them is quietly working against you at the same time. Food is where this gets especially brutal. In a dry season, meat and plants can be sun-dried, smoked, and stored for weeks without much trouble. Take away the sun for a month straight, and that entire preservation system collapses. Smoke drying over an indoor fire becomes the only real option, which means the fire problem and the food problem are actually the same problem wearing two different hats. Some archaeological and ethnographic evidence points to early humans shifting toward foods that were naturally more rain-resistant during wet seasons, tubers and root vegetables that could stay buried and protected underground rather than exposed on a drying rack. It's a small adaptation, but it's the kind of small adaptation that separates a group that eats through a month of rain from one that doesn't. There's a smaller, more personal side to this too, one that rarely makes it into the discussion. Clothing and hides don't just get uncomfortable when they're wet, they stop working entirely. A soaked hide loses most of its insulating value almost immediately, which means the exact moment you need warmth the most during a cold, weeks-long rain is also the moment your clothing is least able to provide it. Evidence from cold, wet regions suggests early humans developed rotation systems for hides and coverings, keeping at least one dry set near the fire at all times while a second set dried out from the previous day's exposure. It sounds almost mundane, laundry as a survival strategy, but getting this wrong in a sustained wet season wasn't a minor discomfort. It was the difference between staying functional and slowly losing the ability to work, hunt, or even move efficiently once hypothermia started creeping in. So what did they actually do about shelter? Shelter design tells a lot of the story. At Starkar, a Mesolithic site in what's now Britain, archaeologists found evidence of a wetland settlement roughly 11,000 years old, built with deliberate timber platforms laid down specifically to manage a landscape that flooded seasonally. People weren't just tolerating the wet ground, they were actively building around it, raising living spaces above the waterline, years before anyone would call this civil engineering. Storage strategy shifted too. Elevated storage structures, some historical and ethnographic parallels show grain and dried food kept off the ground on stilted platforms, specifically to survive prolonged wet seasons without rotting. Thatched or layered roofing, angled steeply enough to shed water instead of pooling it, shows up independently across multiple ancient cultures in wet climates, which is one of those quiet signals that this wasn't one clever tribe's idea. It was a problem so universal that different groups on different continents arrived at nearly identical solutions without ever meeting each other. And then there's the part that almost never gets mentioned. What do you actually do mentally when you're trapped indoors with the same handful of people for weeks with nothing to do but wait? Because that's not a small problem either. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Juhuansi of the Kalahari show a clear behavioral shift during their own wet seasons. Less movement, more time spent close together, and a dramatic increase in one specific activity: storytelling. The same shift researchers have documented for firelit nights happens again during extended wet seasons, just stretched across days instead of hours. Confined groups under stress lean hard into shared narrative, partly for entertainment, but also because storytelling reinforces social bonds exactly when everyone's patience is thinnest and closest quarters make conflict most likely. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that extended indoor confinement may have pushed early social groups toward more elaborate, structured forms of storytelling than the shorter, casual exchanges of an ordinary evening, simply because there were more hours to fill and a much stronger incentive to keep everyone calm, occupied, and getting along. Let's be honest for a second, because this deserves it. A month of being trapped with the same people, in a space that smells like wet smoke and damp hide, with food supplies dwindling and nowhere to actually go, sounds genuinely miserable. Modern humans lose it after 3 days of bad Wi-Fi. Ancient humans didn't get the option to lose it. Losing your temper in a shelter with 6 other people and one exit wasn't a minor social faux pas, it could threaten the survival of the entire group. So social cohesion during rain seasons wasn't just nice to have, it was infrastructure, in the exact same way fire and shelter were infrastructure. Group harmony kept people fed, warm, and alive just as directly as a well-built roof did. In a strange way, patience itself may have been under just as much evolutionary pressure as any physical trait during these stretches. The groups who could hold it together through weeks of forced closeness were the ones who came out the other side intact. There's also a longer, stranger version of this story hiding underneath all of it. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, a sudden climate shift called the Younger Dryas plunged much of the northern hemisphere back into cold, unstable weather after a period of warming, disrupting rainfall patterns dramatically across huge regions. Some researchers connect shifts like this to major behavioral changes in human groups: increased settlement, earlier experiments with cultivating plants, closer, more permanent communities. In other words, unpredictable, extreme weather, the kind that traps you inside for unpredictable stretches, may have nudged some human populations toward exactly the kind of settled, cooperative living that eventually became agriculture. The rain didn't just interrupt daily life, it may have quietly reshaped the entire trajectory of how humans decided to live. So when you think about it, that dripping sound, the one you'd find mildly annoying on a lazy Sunday, was once something ancient humans had to actively engineer around, argue about, adapt their entire shelters for, and somehow survive for weeks at a time without losing their minds or their food supply. They built raised platforms. They angled roofs to shed water before anyone understood physics well enough to explain why it worked. They kept fires alive in shifts through storms that lasted longer than most modern vacations. They told stories to keep each other sane. And in some cases, that same relentless, miserable weather may have nudged the species toward permanent settlement altogether. Next time it rains for 3 days straight and you feel that low simmering restlessness, that itch to just go outside and do something, remember that feeling is ancient. It's the same discomfort that once pushed people to build better roofs, tell longer stories, and stay a little more patient with each other than they wanted to be. The rain hasn't changed, you're just listening to it from somewhere drier.
How did ancient humans survive extreme heat?
You step outside today and the heat makes you dizzy after 10 minutes. You go back inside, turn on the air conditioning, and forget about it by lunch. 90,000 years ago, a human standing in that exact same heat had no doorway to walk back through. For them, those same 10 minutes could be the difference between finding water and not waking up tomorrow. So, how did a body with no walls, no shade on demand, and no bottled water manage to survive that day after day for tens of thousands of years without simply cooking from the inside? It wasn't luck. It wasn't toughness either, the way you might picture some leathery caveman gritting his teeth through it. It was something built directly into their skin, something you are still carrying around right now without ever thinking about it. Your body is covered in roughly 2 million sweat glands, packed most densely across your face and scalp, and researchers studying human evolution have traced the origin of that system back to changes in a single stretch of DNA that controls how many of those glands you grow before you are even born. A 2021 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identified the exact genetic switch responsible, and it is a switch almost no other primate on Earth ever flipped. Chimpanzees, your closest living relatives, sweat at a fraction of the rate you do. You can lose over a liter of water an hour just standing in the heat, sweating it out through skin that evolved specifically to get rid of it. Here is the part nobody thinks about. Your air conditioner is quietly doing the exact job your ancestors' bodies had to do on their own, hour after hour with no setting to turn it up or down. You press a button. Their skin did the work every single day with nowhere to plug in and nothing to switch off. That sweat was only useful because of the second half of the trade, which is that ancient humans lost almost all of their body hair. Fur that thick traps heat against the skin instead of letting sweat evaporate off it, so losing it was not a small decision made once, quietly, in the background. Researchers Daniel Lieberman and Dennis Bramble, writing in the journal Nature in 2004, argued this cooling system evolved together with something else entirely: upright walking and long-distance running, over roughly 2 million years of human evolution. Losing that fur meant losing warmth at night and protection from the sun during the day. It was a bet that cooling down fast was worth almost everything else. Losing that fur created a brand new problem, though, one your body then had to solve all over again from scratch. Bare skin has nowhere to hide from the sun. Anthropologists Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin have spent decades studying what happened next, and their research points to a second adaptation stacked directly on top of the first: skin that darkened with a natural pigment called eumelanin, which blocks ultraviolet radiation from breaking down a nutrient called folate deep in the skin, a nutrient your body needs for healthy pregnancies and basic cell division. Genetic evidence suggests this shift toward darker, sun-protected skin took hold roughly 1.2 million years ago. Your ancestors didn't just adapt to lose heat, they had to adapt to survive the sun they had just exposed themselves to in the process. Skin and sweat were not the only places evolution placed a bet either. Biological anthropologists have long pointed to a pattern known as Bergmann's rule, where populations that evolved in hot, open climates tend toward tall, slender, long-limbed builds, while populations from cold climates tend toward shorter, stockier ones instead. A taller, leaner body carries more skin surface relative to its overall size, and more surface means more room for sweat to evaporate and heat to escape into the air. Populations like the Maasai in East Africa are still cited today as a textbook example of that build. The rule has exceptions, and researchers still debate exactly how much of it is genetic versus cultural adaptation, but the underlying physics is not in dispute. Shape itself can be a cooling strategy, built slowly across thousands of generations standing in the same relentless sun. Right now, if your air conditioning broke this afternoon, you would probably wait it out inside, maybe open a window, maybe complain about it online. Ancient humans had no inside to retreat to at all. The open savanna was the only room they had, and it never came with a thermostat. That bet is what let early humans do something almost no other animal on the savanna could pull off. Anthropologist Louis Liebenberg spent years in the 1990s documenting sand hunters in the Kalahari Desert doing exactly this. And what he watched looked less like hunting and more like an execution carried out by heat itself. The hunters would pick a target animal, an antelope like a kudu, and simply start moving after it during the hottest part of the day when ground temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They were not faster than the kudu, not even close, but the kudu was covered in fur, panting hard to cool itself down, forced to stop and rest in the shade every few minutes just to keep its own body from failing. The humans never stopped. They walked, then jogged, then walked again, tracking footprints pressed into the sand, letting sweat do in silence what the animal's lungs were screaming to do out loud. Hours later, the kudu would finally go down, not from an arrow, not from ordinary exhaustion, but from heat stroke. Its brain had simply reached a temperature it could not survive. Most days looked nothing like that hunt, of course. For ordinary survival, the smarter move was simply timing your life around the heat rather than fighting it head-on. Hunter-gatherer groups across the hottest parts of Africa have long been observed doing the heaviest work of the day in the hours right after sunrise and right before sunset, then resting through the worst of the heat in whatever shade a tree, a rock overhang, or a shallow dugout pit could provide. It sounds almost too simple to count as a real survival strategy, and yet skipping it, pushing straight through the hottest hours instead, is still one of the fastest ways to put a human body into heat stroke today. Running an animal into the ground was never the whole plan either. The same sand communities Liebenberg studied had already solved a bigger problem long before any hunt began, which was water itself. They would dig narrow holes deep into the sand, suck water up through a hollow reed, and spit it into the shell of an ostrich egg, then seal that shell with beeswax and bury it along a hunting route they would use again weeks or even months later. You carry a bottle in a bag for a few hours. They buried the future in the ground and trusted themselves to remember exactly where. Here is what nobody tells you about that hunt, though. The humans were dying too. Just slower, and on purpose. Before a run like that, hunters drank as much water as their stomachs could hold because they knew exactly what the next several hours were going to cost them, and they paid it anyway, every single time. Your own body starts to break down long before you would expect. Lose around 2% of your body weight in water, and your heart rate climbs, and your thinking turns foggy. Lose 10%, and organs start failing. Ancient humans crossing open, shadeless ground in the hottest stretches of Africa were living right at that edge constantly, not as an emergency, but as an ordinary Tuesday. This system was never fixed at birth either, which is part of why it was able to carry humans into so many different climates over time. A 2016 review by exercise physiologist Christopher Tyler and colleagues found that repeated heat exposure over just 1 to 2 weeks measurably improves how efficiently a body cools itself, layering a kind of on-the-fly upgrade on top of the genetic head start every human is already born with. As early humans pushed out of Africa and into new environments, their bodies kept adjusting in real time. The same skin, the same 2 million glands, quietly recalibrating with every new place they landed. That short window of acclimatization cuts both ways, though. It also means a body that spends every summer moving between a cooled house, a cooled car, and a cooled office never gets the chance to build up that edge at all, and can be caught dangerously unprepared on the one day the power goes out or the one day it actually has to work outside in the heat for hours. It is worth sitting with how much of that system you still depend on, whether you notice it or not. According to the National Weather Service, extreme heat kills more people in the United States most years than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined. And the vast majority of those deaths happen to people without reliable access to something as ordinary as air conditioning during the worst days of summer. The biology has not changed at all since the Kalahari. What changed is that most of us almost never have to test it anymore, so we forget it is even there. And somehow, generation after generation, most of your ancestors made it through. Not because the heat ever got easier. It never did. Not once. Not for thousands of years. But because the human body did not evolve to escape heat in the first place. It evolved to survive being fully, completely inside of it, sweating, thinking, tracking, moving the entire time for hours, without a wall or a switch or a door in sight anywhere. So the next time you feel that first wave of heat outside and turn straight back toward your air conditioning, remember what is actually happening underneath your skin in that exact moment. The reason you can feel dizzy after 10 minutes instead of collapsing after 2 is a cooling system your ancestors built and paid for in sweat, 1 liter at a time, long before there was ever a door to walk back through. You come from survivors.
How did ancient humans travel the world?
You are walking right now and you don't think about it. One foot, then the other, across a parking lot, a hallway, a beach. It feels like nothing. But 23,000 years ago, a person walked across a wet lake bed in what's now New Mexico, and that footprint is still there, preserved, mid-stride. Nobody taught that person how to cross a continent that had never once felt a human foot before them. No maps, no boats built for it. So how did people end up literally everywhere on Earth? Deserts, ice sheets, islands you can't even see from land. That footprint is where we start, and it's where we're coming back to. Because between that footprint and the life you're living right now, somebody had to cross open ocean with no idea the land was on the other side. And somebody had to walk into weather that could kill them in an hour for no reason except wanting to know what was out there. Here's the part that should stop you first. Humans did not evolve to travel. We didn't get wings, we didn't get fins, we didn't even get particularly fast legs. What we got was a brain that could plan 5 days ahead on no food and no certainty there'd be anything on the other side. Every other migrating animal on this planet follows a fixed route baked into its instincts. Humans had no such route. Every single fork in the road, every one of the 7 continents we eventually reached was a choice made by someone who had no idea what was over the next hill. That's not nature doing the work. That's a species deciding again and again to walk into the unknown anyway. Think about what that actually demands. Leaving behind the only ground you've ever known, the only water source you trust, on the gamble that something better, or even just survivable, exists somewhere you've never been. Most animals don't take that gamble. We apparently couldn't stop taking it. Ask yourself honestly, could you leave everything you know behind on nothing but a hunch that something better exists? So where does it actually start? Around 70,000 years ago, give or take, this is a wide window. Small groups of modern humans began walking out of East Africa, on foot. Not in some grand planned exodus. In small bands, maybe a few dozen people, following game, following water, following whatever made sense that season. There was no destination in their heads. Nobody was trying to reach Asia. They were trying to eat next week. And that difference matters because it means the spread across the entire planet wasn't a plan. It was thousands of small, local decisions stacked on top of each other for tens of thousands of years, until the sum of all those tiny choices was a species standing on every continent but one. No single person alive during that walk out of Africa ever knew they were part of something that big. Each generation just knew the land immediately around them a little better than the last one did, and passed that knowledge, plus a slightly wider range, onto their kids. The first real barrier out of Africa was the Red Sea. And this is where sea level does something for you that it doesn't do today. During the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. At the southern end of the Red Sea, a strait that's underwater today narrowed into something a person could actually walk or wade across. Not a bridge somebody built, a bridge the planet built and then quietly took back later. Cross that strait, and you're standing in Arabia. And Arabia, right then, wasn't the desert it is now. It was greener, wetter, threaded with rivers that have long since dried into ghosts of themselves. That green corridor is what let people keep moving instead of stalling out at the edge of a continent. Archaeologists have actually found stone tools scattered along those now dry riverbeds, dropped by people who were clearly following the water itself deeper and deeper into a landscape that looks nothing like it used to. But it wasn't just the interior that moved people. It was the coastline itself. Here's the thing most people get backwards. They picture the coast as a wall that stops you. For early humans, it was closer to a highway. Coastlines meant shellfish, fish, a food source that didn't require hunting big, dangerous animals inland. So instead of pushing through unfamiliar interior terrain, thick forest, unknown predators, Groups followed the shoreline from the Arabian Peninsula all the way toward South Asia, one bay, one river mouth, one beach at a time. Researchers call this the coastal migration route, and it may be the single fastest way humans covered long distances in the ancient world. Not because they were rushing, but because the coast kept feeding them the entire way. A group that has to hunt something big and dangerous every few days moves slowly and carefully. A group that can just pick shellfish off the rocks at low tide can afford to keep walking the next morning. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely contested, and I want to be honest about that instead of smoothing it over. For decades, the standard picture was one clean wave. Everybody alive outside Africa today descended from a single migration, maybe 60 to 70,000 years ago, that then fanned out across the planet. Simple story. Except the fossil record kept refusing to cooperate with it. Bones and tools have turned up in places like Greece and southern China that appear to be far older than that single wave timeline allows. In some cases, over 100,000 years old. That's not a rounding error. That's a different story entirely. And it means at least some of those earlier groups were walking into Europe and Asia tens of thousands of years before the wave most textbooks talk about ever left Africa at all. So archaeologists and geneticists are currently split, and it's worth saying plainly. This is a genuinely unresolved argument, not a settled fact I'm simplifying for you. The genetic evidence, DNA pulled from people alive today, compared across populations, points fairly strongly toward one major successful wave. But the fossil and tool evidence suggests there were earlier attempts, smaller groups who pushed out of Africa thousands of years before that main wave, and then, as far as we can tell, didn't leave descendants that survived to today. Failed migrations. Dead ends. Which means the real answer might not be one wave or many waves. It might be that humans tried to leave Africa several times, and we only inherited the genes of the one attempt that actually stuck. New fossil finds keep pushing this argument in different directions almost every year, so whatever version of this timeline you learned in school is probably already out of date. From that coastal route, people kept moving east, through South Asia, into Southeast Asia, and then they hit something that should have stopped everyone. Open water. Even at the Ice Age's lowest sea levels, the gap between Southeast Asia and the landmass that became Australia and New Guinea never fully closed. There was always a stretch, at minimum tens of kilometers, of open ocean you could not walk across, with land you couldn't even see waiting on the far side. And yet, by roughly 65,000 years ago, humans were in Australia. That's not an accident. That's not somebody getting swept out to sea and getting lucky. That is, as far as anyone can tell, the earliest known deliberate open water voyage by any human species, ever. Even Neanderthals, who lived across Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, never managed this crossing. And I want to slow down on how contested that word deliberate actually is, because it's genuinely argued over. One camp says this had to be intentional. You don't accidentally get a breeding population of men, women, and children across that much open water. That takes multiple trips, or one very full one, built and launched on purpose. The other camp points out that a storm surge or tsunami could plausibly wash a group out on floating debris and strand them on a coast they never meant to reach. Nobody left behind a boat for us to check. Organic material like wood and reed simply doesn't survive 65,000 years, so this stays an open question. What we do know is that whatever watercraft they used, it worked well enough more than once for a population to actually take hold on a continent that had never seen a human before. Whichever version is true, imagine being on that water, watching the coastline you know shrink behind you, with absolutely no guarantee anything was waiting ahead. No rescue plan, no way back if you were wrong. Meanwhile, on the complete other side of the planet, a different kind of crossing was opening up. And it's not what most people picture when they hear the word bridge. The Bering Land Bridge wasn't a narrow strip you'd nervously tiptoe across. At its widest, the exposed land connecting Siberia to Alaska was around 1,000 miles wide. An entire subcontinent of its own, covered in grass, home to mammoths and bison that people were actively hunting as they crossed it. It even has its own name among researchers, Beringia. People weren't crossing a bridge so much as living on it. Some for generations, before conditions pushed them further into a continent no human had ever set foot on. Then, the ice melted, the water came back, and the entire landmass simply vanished beneath the Bering Strait, taking most of the physical evidence with it. Which is exactly why so much of this part of the story has to be pieced together from scattered fragments instead of one clean site. But here's the wrinkle that's reshaped this whole picture in the last couple decades. The interior route through Beringia may not have been the only way in, or even the main one. There's a competing idea called the Kelp Highway. The theory that people moved down the Pacific coast in boats, hugging the shoreline from Beringia all the way to South America, living off the incredibly rich marine ecosystems. Kelp forests packed with fish, seals, shellfish, the whole way down. That route would have been faster and far less brutal than trudging through interior Ice Age landscapes on foot. And it would help explain something that used to be a real mystery. How humans seem to show up in South America almost suspiciously early. If people were island hopping and coast hugging by boat instead of forced to wait for an interior corridor to melt open, that head start finally makes sense. Which brings us back to that footprint we opened on. White Sands, New Mexico. 23,000 years old. For a long time, the accepted story was that no human reached the Americas before roughly 16,000 years ago, once the interior ice sheets finally opened a corridor. Those footprints, if the dating holds, blow that timeline apart by 7,000 years. And I have to flag this honestly. The dating method used, seeds found in the same mud layer as the prints, has been challenged by some researchers who argue those seeds could have absorbed older carbon from nearby water and skewed the results too old. Later studies using pollen and a different dating method landed on a similar age range, which strengthens the case, but this is still actively being argued in academic journals, not a closed book. What's not in dispute is that a real person, a real child by some of the smaller prints found nearby, was walking across that mud a very long time ago. The prints even preserve small details like toe pressure and stride length, the kind of thing that turns a fossil into something closer to a single frozen frame of a real moment. Now jump forward and sideways to an entirely different kind of crossing, one with almost no land at all involved. The Pacific is the largest ocean on Earth, dotted with islands separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles of open water. And Polynesian navigators crossed it, repeatedly on purpose in the open ocean, in double-hulled canoes, using zero instruments. No compass, no sextant, no written charts at all. What they had instead was a memorized mental map of the sky. Which stars rise where on the horizon at which time of year, how ocean swells bend and bounce off islands you still can't see, which bird species never fly more than a certain distance from land before turning back toward it. That is a full navigation system, held entirely in human memory and passed down teacher to student for generations, no writing required. Modern sailors who've tried to relearn this method without instruments, on real ocean crossings, describe it as one of the hardest mental disciplines they've ever attempted. And they had someone alive to teach them. The original navigators built it from nothing, and the endpoint of that system is almost too strange to say out loud. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, the single most geographically isolated inhabited point on the entire planet. The nearest inhabited land is over 1,000 miles away in most directions. Nobody drifts there by accident. Reaching it meant deliberately sailing into open ocean with no confirmation land existed on the other side, carrying enough food, water, and breeding populations of plants and animals to actually start a life there if you found it. They found it, and they built one of the most famous, most misunderstood civilizations in human history on a speck of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere, using nothing but the same star and swell knowledge that got their ancestors across the rest of the Pacific. Whatever you think you know about that island's statues, remember first that reaching the island at all was arguably the harder achievement, which leaves exactly one place humans never reached this way, on foot or by ancient boat: Antarctica. Every other continent has human footprints going back tens of thousands of years. Antarctica's oldest human presence is barely 200 years old. 19th century sailors, not ancient migrants. And the reason isn't a lack of courage or curiosity, because clearly this species had plenty of both. It's that the southern ocean surrounding it is some of the most violent, unpredictable water on the planet, and even at the Ice Age's lowest sea. Levels, there was never a land bridge, never a chain of islands close enough together to hop across. The one continent that stayed empty wasn't a failure of nerve. It was simply the one place the geography never gave anyone a way in. Everywhere else on Earth, human persistence eventually found a route. Antarctica is the one place the ocean itself said no, permanently, for tens of thousands of years. Here's the strangest part of the whole journey, and it's written directly into your own body right now. As modern humans spread out of Africa along all these different routes, they didn't travel alone. In parts of Europe and Asia, our ancestors encountered other human species, Neanderthals, and a lesser known group called Denisovans, and they interbred with them. Not metaphorically, literally. If your ancestry traces outside Africa, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA right now is Neanderthal. Some populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania carry meaningful amounts of Denisovan DNA too, genes that, in some cases, still affect immune response and how bodies handle altitude today. The migration didn't just move people across land, it mixed species that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. And the proof of that collision is sitting inside you. Every route this video has walked through, the coast, the strait, the open ocean, left a trace that isn't in a museum somewhere. It's in your cells. So go back to that footprint. 23,000 years old, pressed into mud that's now stone. It wasn't the start of some grand plan to conquer the planet. It was one person taking one more step the same way every single migration in this story happened. One uncertain step at a time, across land bridges that don't exist anymore, in boats that didn't survive to be found, guided by stars memorized instead of written down. You are, right now, walking distances that person could never have imagined possible in a single day. But you're running the exact same software they were running. Curiosity strong enough to override fear of the unknown. That footprint isn't ancient history. It's the reason you're capable of going anywhere at all. Next time you're standing somewhere new, a new city, a new street, anywhere your feet haven't been before. You're not just visiting. You're continuing a walk that started 70,000 years ago and never actually stopped. It didn't end at Easter Island, and it didn't end with you. You come from people who never stopped.
Why did ancient humans have blue skin?
Look at your wrist right now. Right where the skin is thinnest, just under the surface, there's a thread of blue. You've seen it 1,000 times and never once thought to question it. That color isn't supposed to be there. Human blood is red. That's what you were taught in school, in every textbook, on every poster of the human body. But it's sitting blue underneath your own skin, right now, while you're watching this. And once, thousands of years ago, an entire people took that exact fact and turned it into the most terrifying army the Roman Empire had ever faced. So here's the actual question. Were ancient humans born blue, or did they simply find a way to become it? Here's where it gets interesting. In the year 55 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar sailed north into Britain and wrote home about something that genuinely rattled him. He described warriors charging into battle with skin dyed a deep, unnatural blue from head to foot, not painted in patches, soaked in it. The Romans started calling the people north of the wall the Picti, meaning the painted ones. And generations later, that name settled into English as the Picts. Caesar's own soldiers, men who had already conquered half the known world, wrote that the sight of a blue-skinned army screaming out of the fog was enough to break formation before a single sword was even drawn. This wasn't for beauty. Fear, deployed deliberately thousands of years before camouflage or propaganda ever existed, was already a science. And blue was the color an entire people chose to weaponize. But here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. Blue is one of the rarest colors in nature. There's no blue blood, no blue muscle, almost no blue food anywhere on Earth. So where did an Iron Age tribe with no chemistry lab, no dye factory, and no written science get a color that strong? The answer is a small, unremarkable, yellow-flowered plant called woad. Its leaves don't even look blue. They look faintly green. Almost nothing. The blue only appears after a genuinely brutal process, crushing the leaves, letting them rot in fermented urine for weeks to trigger a chemical reaction, then oxidizing the resulting liquid in open air until a deep indigo pigment finally rises to the surface. It's slow, it smells terrible, and it produces one of the most stable natural dyes ever discovered on Earth. Stable enough that fragments of woad-dyed cloth pulled from 2,000-year-old graves are still faintly, unmistakably blue. There's an honest complication here worth flagging before we go further, because not every historian agrees on the woad story. Some archaeologists studying the actual chemistry of woad point out that in the concentrations needed to visibly dye human skin, it's genuinely toxic and would have caused painful blistering rather than clean color. A few researchers have proposed the Picts may have used a different, less documented dye instead, or scarred and tattooed their skin rather than painting it. The written Roman accounts are also secondhand, soldiers describing an enemy they feared, not scientists cataloging pigment. What's not disputed is that the color, the fear, and the name Picti all held. Exactly which substance produced it is still being argued over 2,000 years later. Now here's the strange theory that actually matters more than the paint ever did. Woad was a dye sitting on top of skin, nothing more. But is it possible for a human body to turn blue from the inside, with no plant, no ink, nothing painted on it all? It sounds like something pulled straight out of a comic book. It is not. Somewhere in the hills of Kentucky in the early 1900s, doctors kept encountering the exact same impossible patient over and over again. A person born with skin the color of a fresh bruise that never once faded, blue from birth all the way to death, and otherwise completely medically healthy. Their name was Fugate, and the story begins with one French orphan named Martin Fugate, who settled beside a creek called Troublesome in the early 1800s while carrying an extremely rare recessive gene he almost certainly never knew he had. He married a local woman who, by pure coincidence, carried that exact same rare mutation. In a small, isolated mountain community where families intermarried for generations simply because there was nobody else around to marry, that rare gene met itself again and again across decades. By the 1960s, doctors were still finding great-great-grandchildren of Martin Fugate walking around Troublesome Creek with skin ranging from pale lavender to a deep, startling navy blue. Locals didn't find it strange at all. They'd grown up around it their entire lives. It actually took an outside doctor sent in to investigate what looked on paper like a mystery illness to realize this one family had quietly been blue for 5 straight generations. So what was actually happening inside their blood? The condition is called methemoglobinemia, and the mechanism is almost unbelievably simple once you actually see it laid out. Hemoglobin is the molecule inside your red blood cells responsible for carrying oxygen, and it's also what gives blood its bright red color. In someone with this mutation, an enzyme that's supposed to reset hemoglobin after it releases its oxygen doesn't work properly. The hemoglobin gets stuck in an oxidized state that can't carry oxygen efficiently anymore. And that stuck form isn't bright red at all. It's a dark, bluish brown. Multiply that shift across billions of blood cells moving just beneath translucent skin, and the entire body reads as blue to the naked eye. The Fugates weren't sick, not really. They were, in a very real sense, carrying oxygen slightly differently than everyone standing around them. And their skin was simply honestly telling the truth about it. But before we go any further into ancient skin, there's one more layer to this that changes everything. Because the Fugates aren't even the most famous blue human in modern history. That title actually belongs to a man named Paul Carrison. And unlike the Fugates, nobody in his family handed this down to him. He did it to himself, entirely on purpose, starting in the early 2000s. Paul had a skin condition and began drinking a homemade silver solution as a treatment, a practice with roots stretching back centuries to a time before antibiotics existed, when silver really was one of the only substances doctors had that could reliably kill certain infections. He drank it for years, steadily, without stopping. And slowly, permanently, his skin turned a deep, metallic slate blue. Visible on national television, filmed for documentaries, unmistakable even from clear across a room. His condition has a name too, argyria. Silver particles had lodged themselves permanently into the deepest layer of his skin and reacted with ordinary sunlight, essentially plating him in a thin, living layer of metal. Two completely different roads. One written into his genes, one chosen with a glass of water. Both arrived at exactly the same color. Here's the strange part: almost nobody actually explains properly. Silver doesn't turn skin blue the way you'd expect an ordinary stain to work. The particles are so unbelievably small that they sink straight into the deepest layer of skin and get permanently trapped there. The body has genuinely no way to break them down or flush them back out. Sunlight then triggers a slow chemical reaction with those trapped particles, similar to the reaction happening inside old photographic film, and that specific reaction is what produces the blue-gray color people actually see. It isn't a bruise, it isn't a rash, and it never heals because there is nothing left to heal from. The metal is simply there now, for the rest of that person's entire life, quietly reacting to daylight every single day. Then there's a version of this you've actually experienced yourself and probably never thought twice about. Hold your breath right now, for as long as you comfortably can, and pay close attention to your lips and fingertips near the end. That faint blue-gray tint creeping in is called cyanosis, and it's the exact same underlying story as the fugates, just temporary. When your blood is briefly starved of oxygen, from holding your breath, from freezing cold, from extreme altitude, hemoglobin shifts toward that same darker, bluer state. Your own body is showing you, in real time, precisely what generations of the fugate family lived with permanently, every single day of their lives. Every human being on Earth is carrying the exact same blue-capable blood chemistry. Most of us simply never push it far enough or long enough to watch it settle in. There's also a physics problem tucked inside all of this that's genuinely worth pulling apart. That blood sitting underneath your skin right now isn't actually blue at all. It's a dark brownish red, even in its deoxygenated state. What you're actually seeing through your skin is a trick of light. Skin scatters short blue wavelengths back toward your eye far more than it scatters longer red wavelengths, especially over something dark sitting deep beneath the surface. So the vein tracing across your wrist looks blue for almost the exact same optical reason the sky looks blue. Light bouncing selectively, not the true color of whatever's actually underneath. Ancient people, with none of this physics available to them, still noticed the pattern and built entire belief systems trying to explain it. That same trick of light is also where an entirely different piece of human history comes from. One you've probably said out loud without ever connecting it to any of this. The phrase blue blood, used for centuries to describe European nobility, comes from exactly the vein you're looking at right now. Aristocratic families who stayed indoors, out of the sun, kept skin pale enough that the blue-looking veins underneath were unusually visible compared to sun-darkened laborers working outside all day. Pale skin, visible veins, and the assumption that visible blue blood meant unmixed, untanned, high-status ancestry turned into a class marker that lasted for generations. An entire social hierarchy built on the same optical illusion sitting on your own wrist right now. Populations living at extreme altitude ran into a version of this constantly, generation after generation. At high elevation, the air simply holds less oxygen, and the body compensates by producing far more red blood cells than normal. Sometimes so many that blood becomes visibly thick and dark, and lips and fingertips take on a permanent, noticeable bluish tinge. Communities living high in the Andes and high in the Himalayas experience this exact coloring generation after generation as simply normal. It wasn't treated as a disease. It was just what a human body looked like up there. The same unremarkable way a deep suntan is just what skin looks like near the equator. There's one more piece of this puzzle that almost nobody connects to any of it, and it starts in ancient Egypt roughly 4,500 years ago. Egyptian chemists, and that word is accurate, not an exaggeration, figured out how to combine sand, copper, and limestone at extremely precise temperatures to create something the natural world simply doesn't offer on its own. A true, stable, synthetic blue pigment. Historians now call it Egyptian blue, and it's considered the very first man-made pigment in recorded human history. It shows up on tomb walls, on jewelry, on the skin of painted gods, preserved in colors that are still vivid after more than 4,000 years. And because Egypt actually had a word and a material for genuine blue, while most of the ancient world simply didn't, Egyptian texts are some of the only ancient writing that references the color blue directly at all. That absence matters more than it sounds like it should. Linguists studying ancient texts across dozens of separate cultures found that blue was consistently one of the very last colors to ever get its own dedicated word. Ancient Greek poetry famously describes the sea as wine dark, never blue, despite staring at it every single day. When something is rare enough that entire ancient languages don't even have a name for it yet, and then a human being shows up actually wearing it, that stops being decoration. That becomes an event. And ancient cultures on opposite sides of the world, with zero contact with each other, landed on the exact same color for the exact same reason: power beyond ordinary human limits. In Hindu tradition, Krishna is painted blue-skinned across thousands of years of art, a color meant to signal the infinite, the color of open sky and deep ocean, something too vast to be contained inside an ordinary human body. Shiva carries a blue throat for a darker reason entirely. Mythology says he swallowed a poison capable of destroying the entire universe to save every other god from it, and that poison stained his throat permanently blue as living proof of exactly what he'd survived. Two completely different stories. One born from divinity, one born from sacrifice, both reaching for the exact same color as something too extreme for an ordinary body to hold. So go back to the Picts standing on that Roman battlefield with all of this now sitting in your head. They weren't wearing a color people simply found pretty. They were wearing a color that, across the ancient world, independently and repeatedly, kept getting assigned to gods, to poison, to forces beyond a normal body's limits. A blue-skinned figure charging out of the mist wasn't just visually startling to Roman soldiers, it was tapping into something closer to instinct. The same unease extreme altitude or extreme oxygen deprivation can trigger in a human body without a single word being spoken. The dye wasn't a costume, it was a message, understood on a level older than language itself. And that raises an uncomfortable question nobody's ever fully answered. In an era with no photography and almost no written medical records for most of the population, how would anyone actually tell the difference between a warrior dyed blue with woad and a rare person who, like the distant, scattered ancestors of the Fugate family, whose exact mutation almost certainly existed in isolated form long before it concentrated inside one Kentucky valley, was simply born that way? It's entirely possible ancient societies encountered both versions of blue skin, painted and genuine, without ever having any real way to separate myth from biology. Maybe some of those old legends were only ever describing the paint, and maybe some of them quietly weren't. Today, true blue skin from methemoglobinemia is still real, still documented, and still almost unbelievably rare, usually triggered by certain medications, certain rare genetic mutations, or oxygen problems present at birth. And it's now usually treatable with a simple dose of a compound called methylene blue, which resets the stuck hemoglobin within minutes. What took the Fugate family 5 full generations to even begin to understand, modern doctors can now correct in a single afternoon. A condition that once looked like folklore tucked away in an isolated mountain valley turned out to be pure, explainable chemistry the entire time. Chemistry nobody had simply bothered to look closely enough at yet. Look at your wrist one more time. That thin thread of blue tracing just beneath your skin isn't a flaw, and it isn't nothing. It's the exact same chemistry that turned a Kentucky family blue for 5 straight generations. The exact same physics ancient cultures wrapped inside myths about gods and poison, and the exact same color a Roman army once mistook for something beyond human entirely. You've been carrying it since before you were even born. It just takes the right conditions: cold, altitude, a rare gene, a held breath, to finally bring it to the surface. You were never as far from blue as you thought.
Why did ancient humans marry their siblings?
You are sitting at a family dinner right now, and you pass a dish of food to your brother or sister without even thinking about it. It is the most unremarkable moment of your entire week. Now, picture that same sibling is also your spouse. Not a joke, not a scandal whispered in secret. For one of the most powerful families that ever lived, that was not the exception. That was the rule, written into law, expected of every single generation without question. So here's the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in the back of your mind right now. Why did some of the most powerful people in ancient history marry their own brothers and sisters, on purpose, again and again for centuries? Stick with me, because the real answer is not what you think, and it starts with one single stone carving. Two names, side by side, sealed into the same bloodline forever. Here is where it gets interesting. In 2010, a team of geneticists, led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, ran DNA tests on the mummified remains of Tutankhamun, the boy king everyone recognizes from that golden mask, and published their results in a major medical journal. They were not chasing a scandal. They were mapping his family tree using genetic markers pulled straight from his own bones, comparing him against a dozen other mummies believed to be relatives. What they found stunned even the researchers who ran the test. Tutankhamun's mother and father were not distant cousins, and they were not even second cousins from the same royal court. The genetic markers matched at a level that meant only one thing. They were full brother and sister, raised in the same royal nursery as children, and then married to each other as adults to produce the very child who would one day wear that mask the whole world recognizes. This was not one strange accident buried inside a single family line. Once researchers went looking, the same pattern showed up over and over across generation after generation of Egypt's royal dynasties, stretching back centuries before Tutankhamun was even born. Pharaohs married their full sisters. Some pharaohs married their own daughters. It shows up so consistently in tomb inscriptions and temple carvings that modern Egyptologists no longer treat it as rumor. They treat it as a documented, deliberate structural feature of how the entire Egyptian monarchy actually functioned, sitting right at the top of a system engineered to keep that throne locked inside one single, unbroken bloodline forever. So why would anyone build a whole system around this on purpose? Here is the answer Egyptian religion actually gave, and it is stranger than you might expect. The pharaoh was never treated as an ordinary human ruler the way a king or a president is today. The pharaoh was believed to be a living god, walking around on earth in human form, directly descended from the sun god Ra himself. And here is the part that explains everything else. In Egyptian mythology, the gods themselves married their own siblings. Osiris married his own sister Isis, and together they were worshipped as the ideal, sacred royal couple. If the human royal family was going to claim they were literally divine, walking gods on earth, then marrying inside the family was not something to hide in shame. It was proof. It was the family physically living out the same sacred pattern the gods themselves had already set over and over, generation after generation. But before we go any further, there is a claim buried in this story that needs to be flagged honestly, because Egyptologists still genuinely argue about it. It is tempting to assume every single person living in ancient Egypt married a sibling. That is simply not accurate, and it is worth saying clearly. This practice, as far as the surviving archaeological evidence actually shows, was almost entirely confined to the royal family itself, and possibly a small circle of the very highest nobility surrounding the throne. Ordinary Egyptian farmers, laborers, and merchants married outside their own immediate family, largely the same as most other ancient societies of the time. So this was never a nationwide custom practiced in every village. It was a narrow elite exception, deliberately engineered around one specific bloodline that was believed to be far too sacred to dilute with outsiders. Now, here is a real family where you can watch this entire pattern play out across generations. The pharaoh known as Akhenaten, famous for trying to force all of Egypt to worship a single sun disk god, did not just marry his famous queen Nefertiti. Historical inscriptions and modern genetic evidence both point to Akhenaten also fathering children with at least one of his own sisters, and Tutankhamun himself is now widely believed to be the direct son of that sibling union. That means the boy king everyone recognizes from museum posters was the product of a family that had already been marrying inward for at least 2 full generations in a row, tightening the same genetic loop a little further with every single generation that passed. Here is where the human cost becomes almost impossible to ignore. When researchers examined Tutankhamun's mummified body more closely using modern medical scanning, they did not find a healthy young king underneath those golden bandages. They found a boy with a clubbed foot that likely forced him to walk leaning on a cane, clear evidence of bone tissue death in one leg, a partial cleft palate, and traces of severe, repeated malaria infections buried in his own tissue. Some researchers connect these health problems directly to generations of close family inbreeding, concentrating harmful genetic traits inside one bloodline. Other Egyptologists push back hard and argue his health issues could just as easily be explained by disease alone, with no need to invoke inbreeding as the cause, and that specific debate remains genuinely unresolved among specialists today. What nobody seriously debates is the physical evidence sitting inside his own tomb. Archaeologists found over 100 separate walking canes buried alongside him, and many of them show clear wear marks from genuine daily use, not just symbolic ceremonial decoration for the afterlife. But before we get to the strangest turn in this entire story, there is one more layer worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine actually growing up as a member of this family. Every marriage partner you will ever have in your life is already decided before you are even born, and it is someone who grew up in the exact same nursery you did. There was no scandal to whisper about at court because there was nothing secret about any of it. It was simply expected, openly celebrated in public, and carved permanently into temple walls, in front of crowds, for the entire kingdom to witness and to approve of forever. Here's the twist almost nobody expects walking into this video. You would probably assume this custom was purely uniquely Egyptian, born entirely out of Egyptian religion. It was not. Roughly 300 years before the birth of Christ, a completely foreign dynasty seized control of Egypt, and they kept the exact same sibling marriage tradition running for centuries afterward, for a reason that had almost nothing to do with gods at all. This was the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by a general named Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's own trusted commanders, a Greek Macedonian family that was never ethnically Egyptian to begin with. And here's the strange theory that actually explains why they kept marrying siblings anyway, generation after generation, in a culture that was not even originally theirs. It almost certainly was not religious devotion to Ra or Osiris. It was cold, calculated, deliberate politics. Think about the specific problem a foreign ruling family faces sitting on someone else's ancient throne. If a Ptolemaic ruler married into a powerful Egyptian noble family, or into a rival Greek dynasty from a neighboring kingdom, that single marriage instantly created a rival claim to the throne. A brother-in-law, a father-in-law, an entire outside family suddenly holding real leverage and real armies. But if a brother married his own sister instead, all of that danger disappeared instantly and completely. No outside family could ever gain a foothold inside the palace because there was no outside family involved in the marriage at all. Every drop of political power stayed locked inside one single household, generation after generation, with nobody new ever allowed in the door. This is exactly the family that eventually produced the most famous name in this entire story. Cleopatra VII, the very last true pharaoh of Egypt, was married first to her own younger brother, a boy king named Ptolemy XIII, and later married to a second younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, after the first one died fighting her directly in a civil war between the two of them. Her family had already been marrying siblings for roughly 250 years by the time she was even born, which means Cleopatra was not some rare exception inside her own family line at all. She was simply following the exact same political script every single Ptolemaic ruler before her had already followed, for the same cold, practical reason of keeping every possible rival claim permanently locked outside the palace walls. So now you have two completely different explanations for the exact same behavior, separated by different centuries, different bloodlines, and even different religions entirely. The native Egyptian pharaohs married siblings because they genuinely believed they were living gods, mirroring the sacred marriage of Isis and Osiris in heaven above. The Ptolemaic Greeks who arrived centuries later married siblings for the exact opposite reason, pure political survival, sealing every rival threat permanently outside the family door. Same exact practice, two totally different reasons for choosing it. And both families landed on the identical solution completely independently, which should tell you something important about what unchecked power actually does to a family. Here is a comparison that puts everything you have just heard into even sharper focus. Almost 2,000 years after Cleopatra, on the completely opposite side of the world, One of the most powerful royal families in Europe fell into a strikingly similar trap, for a strikingly similar reason. The Habsburg dynasty ruled Spain and Austria for centuries, and to keep their empire's wealth and titles from ever leaving the family, they repeatedly married first cousins, and sometimes an uncle to a niece, generation after generation, in a pattern chillingly close to what you just learned about Egypt. The result was written directly onto the family's own faces. Portrait after portrait shows the same unmistakable protruding lower jaw, a genetic trait now known simply as the Habsburg jaw, so severe in the dynasty's final king that he could barely chew his own food. Same closed bloodline instinct, same royal justification of protecting the family's power, and strikingly similar physical consequences showing up in the body. Thousands of miles and thousands of years away from the Nile. Here is the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. Egypt and the Habsburgs were not remotely alone in this, not even close. The Inca Empire in South America had its own version of this exact custom, where the supreme ruler known as the Sapa Inca often married a full sister specifically to preserve the same idea of one unbroken sacred bloodline. Native Hawaiian royal families, half a world away, with zero contact with either Egypt or the Inca Empire, independently developed a strikingly similar custom for their very highest-ranking chiefs. Separate civilizations, on separate continents with absolutely no contact between any of them, all independently arrived at the exact same extreme solution to the exact same underlying problem, which is how do you keep supreme power from ever slipping outside the walls of one single family? Now here is the darkest layer of this entire story, the part that rarely makes it into any highlight reel about ancient Egypt. This was never a system designed with the actual individual family members in mind. A royal sibling did not choose this life for themselves. They were born directly into a role that had already been decided for them before birth, and refusing that role was simply not a realistic option available to a member of the ruling family. Some royal children in these dynasties were formally married off to a sibling as young teenagers, and sometimes even younger, the moment their bodies were considered physically ready to eventually produce an heir. The entire arrangement existed purely to serve the bloodline and the throne itself, not the two actual people standing at the altar on their own wedding day. But here's the strange part that this contested claim forces us to sit with, honestly, without flinching from it. Despite everything modern science tells us about the real genetic risks of close family reproduction, some of these exact dynasties lasted for an extraordinarily long time regardless. The Ptolemaic family ruled Egypt for close to 3 centuries straight through repeated sibling marriages before Rome finally absorbed the kingdom completely, following Cleopatra's own death. That fact is not proof the practice was medically safe. Modern genetics is very clear that repeated inbreeding across multiple generations sharply raises the odds of harmful conditions surfacing, exactly like the very health problems already found inside Tutankhamun's own preserved body, and that the very jaw already visible across those Habsburg portraits. But it does explain uncomfortably why a small, closed elite kept choosing this same path again and again anyway. In their own eyes, the political and religious payoff of an unbreakable bloodline was worth a genetic risk they most likely did not even fully understand at the time they were living through it. So why did the entire practice eventually stop for good? The real answer is almost anticlimactic after everything you have just learned about it. It was not a sudden moral awakening happening inside the royal family itself. It was a military and political ending, delivered entirely from the outside. After Cleopatra's own death, Egypt stopped being an independent kingdom altogether and became a distant province of Rome. And Roman law simply did not permit sibling marriage the way Egyptian and Ptolemaic tradition once openly had. The tradition did not gradually fade out on its own terms over time. It was shut down almost overnight by outside conquest after running essentially unbroken for well over 2,000 continuous years, and the Habsburgs across the ocean would not learn their own version of the same lesson for another 17 centuries after that. Which leaves one honest question hanging over the entire story before we close it out. Why does a pattern this costly, this openly criticized by outsiders even at the time, keep reappearing independently across completely unconnected civilizations? The most convincing answer researchers keep landing on is not really about sex or scandal at all. It is about absolute power and the terror of ever having to share it. When a family convinces itself its authority is too sacred or too valuable to risk on any outsider, the closed bloodline stops looking irrational from the inside. It starts looking like the only safe option left on the table, even when the cost is written permanently into the next generation's own body. Which brings us right back to that single carved stone from the very beginning of this video. Two names side by side, sealed together onto the same cartouche, locked into one bloodline forever. That was never just decoration carved into a tomb wall for looks. It was the entire point of the whole system laid bare in solid stone. A family so utterly convinced its own bloodline was too sacred or too politically valuable to ever let a single outsider touch it, that it turned marriage itself into a wall built specifically to keep the rest of the world permanently out. You share a dinner table with your own sibling tonight without a second thought. They shared a throne.
Why did ancient humans eat each other to survive?
Two people. One winter. One of them lay down in the snow and starved. The other picked up a bone that used to belong to someone they knew and cracked it open for the marrow. Eat or die. Ancient humans really did eat each other. We've found the bones. But here's the part that haunts archaeologists. Those bones can tell us why. Starvation or ritual? And the proof that finally settles it isn't a bone at all. This isn't a myth, and it isn't a single freak case. Archaeologists have pulled cannibalized human bones out of the ground on 3 continents, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. You're looking at the aftermath of the worst decision a person can make. And somehow, in bone this old, that decision left a signature, the way a crime scene leaves one. Go back far enough and it's not an exception at all. At a site called Grandolina in Spain, bones from a species called Homo antecessor are 800,000 years old, the oldest evidence found. Almost a third of the human bones there carry cut marks, processed exactly like the deer and horse beside them, including the bones of a child. This wasn't rare. It goes back almost to the start of us. Here's the roadmap. 3 signs are hidden in these bones: how deep they cracked them, what they carved into them, and one thing buried in the ground beside them. Together, those 3 signs tell you whether you're looking at a ritual, a war, or a family that was simply starving to death. But here's the problem. A bone doesn't come with a note. It doesn't confess. So how do you read horror off something this quiet? Turns out, starvation has a pattern, almost like a recipe followed under duress. When a person is eaten because there is nothing else to eat, the body gets processed the way you'd process an animal you were desperate not to waste. Flesh is cut away first, clean, V-shaped strokes from a stone blade. Then the joints are pulled apart. And almost everywhere you find this kind of starvation site, there's a pattern in what they went for first before anything else. Not the meatiest part, not the easiest part. I'll tell you exactly what that means in a minute. Hold that thought. Then, and this is the part that gives it away. The long bones get cracked open, hard, to get at the marrow inside, the way you'd crack a bone at the dinner table for the last good bite. Even that isn't enough. The soft, spongy bone gets crushed and boiled, just to render out the last of the fat. Nothing gets left on the plate. There's even a texture forensic scientists look for. The ends of some bones are worn smooth, almost polished, from being stirred again and again in a cooking pot, the same way a wooden spoon wears smooth after years of the same soup. It's called pot polish. And once you know to look for it, you cannot unsee what it means. That's the fingerprint of hunger. And we're about to see it again. And this isn't just a theory built on old bones alone. Almost 200 years later, in the Arctic, the crew of a doomed ship called the Franklin Expedition left the exact same signature behind: pot polish, marrow cracking, everything, when their food ran out and rescue never came. Different century, different continent, same desperate math. That's how you know the fingerprint is real. It shows up wherever people run out of food, not just once, in one place. Now put that fingerprint to the test. Northern Spain, roughly 49,000 years ago. A cave called El Sidron holds the bones of at least 12 Neanderthals, what looks like an extended family. And their bones check every box: slice marks on the flesh, long bones cracked for marrow, skulls opened, brains and tongues eaten. But the real proof isn't in what was done to them after they died, it's in their teeth. Their enamel carries lines: scars from repeated periods of arrested growth, moments as children and teenagers when their bodies simply stopped growing because there wasn't enough food, almost like tree rings marking bad years. Their diet was mostly plants and nuts. Meat was rare. This wasn't a family that occasionally struggled. This was a family that had been starving, on and off, their entire lives long before anyone touched a knife. Whatever happened in that cave wasn't the beginning of their hunger. It was just the end of it. Here's where a skeptic pushes back. Bones cracked for marrow could still be ritual. People have eaten their dead out of grief or respect, the same instinct behind a funeral rite today. Plenty of cultures have done exactly that, treating the body of someone they loved as something to be honored, not discarded. So could this. Nothing about broken bone alone proves hunger over reverence. Which means El Sidron, as devastating as it is, isn't the case that closes the argument. It's close. It's not airtight. So where's the site where the evidence doesn't just suggest it proves? Colorado, about 1150 CE. A place called Cowboy Wash. 7 people at least dismembered, flesh stripped, bones roasted, cracked open the same desperate way. Skulls scorched and opened. It happened during a drought so severe it had lasted years in early spring, right when the last winter stores would have run out. Imagine your pantry empty in March with no harvest for months. And then archaeologists found something no one expected. A single piece of human waste, fossilized, sitting in the ash of a cooking hearth. Not a bone. Not a cut mark. Waste. The kind of thing that shouldn't survive 900 years, let alone prove anything. They tested it, almost like running a modern crime lab's DNA swab. It came back positive for human myoglobin, a protein that exists nowhere except inside human muscle. The only way it ends up in someone's gut is if they ate human flesh. They tested the cooking pot too. Same result. That's it. That's the one piece of evidence that doesn't rely on how you read a cut mark or how well carved a skull looks or which expert you trust. It doesn't argue. A pot and a piece of waste sitting in a burned out hearth for 900 years proved what 100 cracked bones could only suggest. This is starvation, cornered, with no room left to argue otherwise. So, if we can prove hunger this cleanly, does that mean every cracked, butchered pile of human bone is a starvation story? No. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because the same toolkit that convicts Cowboy Wash, the same kit a modern detective would carry, acquits other sites of starvation completely. England, Guff's Cave, about 14,700 years ago. Same species as us, same era as some of the last Ice Age hunters. Extensive cannibalism here too. But the bones tell a different story. 3 human skulls were meticulously shaped into cups, edges smoothed with real craft, the kind of care you'd put into carving something meant to be kept, not eaten. A human arm bone carries a deliberate zigzag pattern engraved as part of the butchery itself. That's not calorie maximizing. That's extra. That's care spent on something that adds zero nutrition. The forensic read, ritual, not hunger, and it doesn't stop there. In Belgium, a cave called Goyet, Neanderthal bones butchered exactly like the reindeer and horses beside them. Recent genetic work suggests the victims weren't local. They were outsiders. Strangers, not family, not neighbors. That looks less like hunger and more like conflict. In Poland, a site called Mashika, bones from at least 10 people, over 2/3 of them cut and cracked, brains removed, ears sliced off. Researchers there argue starvation doesn't fit. The population was growing, food wasn't that scarce. Their read, these were enemies, eaten after a fight. Same cracked bones, same cut marks, same era even. Guff's Cave and Mashika are the same culture, roughly the same age, and one reads as sacred, the other as slaughter. 2 sites, same toolkit, completely different verdict, which tells you the bones were never the whole story on their own. The bones don't just prove that this happened. Read carefully enough, they prove why. And to survive is only one answer among several. So when it really was survival, when hunger, not ritual, not war, was the only reason left. What did it actually take to push a person there? Would you have crossed that line? Here's the part that should unsettle you the most, and it isn't even ancient. Virginia, the winter of 1609 into 1610, colonists called it the starving time. James Fort went from roughly 300 people to about 60. 4 out of every 5 did not survive, like your entire street being wiped down to a handful of houses in a single season. Among the dead, a 14-year-old English girl archaeologists now call Jane. Forensic analysis showed her skull was struck and carefully pried open. Cheek meat, tongue, and leg muscle had been removed. She was found in a pit alongside butchered horse and dog. Desperate people eating whatever was left in whatever order it went bad. This isn't a Neanderthal. This isn't 50,000 years ago. This is 400 years ago, closer to your grandparents' grandparents than to the Ice Age. And remember what I asked you to hold on to. The pattern in what they went for first. At Jamestown and at Cowboy Wash and at El Cedron, the brain was targeted early, before almost anything else. It's not cruelty. It's chemistry. The brain rots faster than any other organ, so it has to be used fast. The way the freshest thing in your fridge is always the first thing that goes bad. And it's the single fattest, most calorie-dense tissue in the entire human body. When your body is eating itself alive from the inside, the brain isn't a trophy. It's just the best math available, worked out by people who had nothing left to calculate with but hunger. That's the subplot, closed. Even the order of the horror was survival, calculating to the very last calorie. So 2 people, 1 winter. One of them ran out of time. The other made a choice that a starving brain will make when there's nothing else left to eat. Not out of cruelty, not out of ritual, just math, cold and final. Eat or die. The bones remember which one it was. They always do. Which one do you think you'd have been? Tell me in the comments. I actually read them.
Why did ancient humans get pregnant at 12?
Think about a 12-year-old you actually know, stressing over a group chat, not finished with their homework, not allowed to walk to a friend's house alone yet. Nobody hands that kid a household to run. Nobody expects them to be somebody's parent. Now, cross the ocean of time back to ancient Rome and meet a different 12-year-old, married, standing in front of a husband old enough to be her father, with a household and a pregnancy both expected to start any day now. Her body was, at best, only halfway built for it. And in her world, not one person in that room thought this was unusual. So what actually set that age? Not simple ignorance. That explanation falls apart the second you look closely. 4 separate things had to line up. A chemical switch buried inside puberty itself, a cold arithmetic problem about death, a support system almost nobody mentions when they tell this story, and a legal number that outlived the reasons anyone had for writing it down. Stick around because the one that actually decided the age probably isn't the one you're picturing right now. The explanation you've probably heard is people just died young, so they crammed everything in early. It sounds tidy. It's also wrong in a specific, provable way. That average age 30 number is real, but it's not measuring what people assume it measures. It's an average, and one brutal fact is dragging it down. Huge numbers of ancient children never made it past age 5. Stack enough of those early deaths into one dataset and the whole average collapses, even if plenty of adults were living long lives. Here's the proof. Survive childhood. And the math flips hard. Someone who made it to 15 could reasonably expect decades more. Ancient people regularly lived into their 50s and 60s, and Greek tombstones record people well past 80. Reaching old age wasn't some freak exception. It happened often enough that grandparents were a normal, expected part of a household. Keep that detail in your pocket. It's going to matter later. So the everyone died at 30 story doesn't actually explain the number 12. Something else said it, and it starts in a place most people never think to look. Inside puberty's own chemistry. Before we get to biology, look at what was actually on the books. In ancient Rome, the legal minimum age for a girl to marry was 12. Not socially tolerated, legally defined, written into the same code that governed property and citizenship. For elite families with alliances and inheritances to protect, marrying a daughter off at 12 or 13 wasn't shocking. It was strategy, a corporate merger with a child standing where the signature should be. Move to ancient Greece, and the number creeps up. Girls typically married between 14 and 18, to men often a decade or more older, the marriage itself functioning as a negotiated economic transaction. But a legal number on a scroll doesn't tell you what was happening inside actual 12-year-old bodies. For that, you need something that doesn't lie: bone. When a woman gives birth, her pelvis can be left with a permanent mark, small pits on the pubic bone called dorsal pubic pitting, one of the only skeletal features researchers trust as a genuine scar of childbirth. Enough of those pits across enough skeletons in a cemetery, and you can start estimating how common and how young motherhood really was. Teeth keep an even stranger diary. A child going through serious illness or starvation has their enamel growth pause for a few weeks, sealing a visible line into the tooth forever. Linear enamel hypoplasia. Long bones carry their own version, Harris lines, laid down whenever growth briefly stalls and restarts. Because teeth grow on a predictable schedule, scientists can calculate almost to the year how old that child was when their body hit crisis mode. Somewhere in a lab drawer right now, there's a 2,000-year-old tooth that remembers the exact month a kid nearly starved. And buried in that same enamel data is a detail about puberty itself that's going to complicate this entire story. Hold on to that. We're coming right back to it. Here it is. You'd assume ancient and medieval kids hit puberty younger. Rougher lives, no processed food, bodies maturing fast out of necessity. A major study of medieval English skeletons tested that directly using those same enamel and bone stress markers and found the opposite. Puberty back then lined up almost identically with modern averages, sitting around 14 in classical and medieval sources. Here's the mechanism some researchers point to. Puberty may function almost like a fuel gauge. One hypothesis, genuinely debated, not settled science first proposed decades ago and still argued over today, claims the body needs a minimum threshold of stored fat before it green lights reproduction, because pregnancy and breastfeeding are staggeringly expensive in calories. Other researchers push back hard on that exact theory, pointing instead to brain and nervous system maturity as the real trigger. What both sides agree on, regardless of which mechanism wins, is the pattern itself. Chronic food insecurity delays puberty, sometimes by years, across wildly different populations and eras. So a rough, hungry environment doesn't rush the body toward 12. If anything, it can just as easily stall it toward 15 or 16, the opposite of what most people would guess. So if bodies weren't maturing faster back then, what actually pushed the age down for the people it did happen to? This is the part evolutionary biologists call life history theory, and it's colder than anything we've covered so far. When death from outside forces, disease, famine, violence, brutal childbirth odds, is constantly high, a population under that pressure gets selected, generation after generation, toward maturing and reproducing earlier. Not because anyone chose it consciously, because waiting was a bet you might not live long enough to collect on. Every fertile woman in a small ancient community was a scarce, essential resource for that group's survival. Lose too many of them, and the group doesn't get a second chance. Skeletal evidence backs this up directly. Pelvic stress patterns on adolescent remains consistent with childbirth before the pelvis had finished growing, which for the human female pelvis can continue reshaping into the early 20s. That's not a natural arrangement working out fine. It's a brutal cost-benefit calculation, repeated across cultures and centuries, because the alternative, not replacing the people lost to disease and famine, was worse. Think of it like a company that keeps losing staff to an unpredictable disaster. At some point, hire and train faster stops being a strategy and starts being the only option left. Remember that grandparent detail from earlier? This is where it pays off, and it might be the single most important piece of this entire puzzle. Human females do something almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. Their fertility ends decades before their life does. Biologically, that's an odd design choice. Once an individual can no longer reproduce, evolution generally has little reason to keep investing in keeping them alive. So, why did that pattern stick around in our species specifically? The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes chased that exact question through fieldwork with the Hadza people of Tanzania and found something worth sitting with. When older women kept working, digging roots, hauling food, watching toddlers, their daughters didn't have to. That freed the younger women to stop breastfeeding sooner and get pregnant again faster, because someone dependable was covering the gap. Hawkes even measured it in the kids themselves. A child's growth tracked how much its own mother was bringing in, right up until a new sibling arrived. After that, the child's growth started tracking grandma's labor instead. Researchers now have a name for this: alloparenting, meaning the job of raising a child gets spread across the whole group, not carried by one exhausted parent alone. A very young mother in one of these communities almost never did the hardest parts by herself. She had backup built by women who could no longer have children but had every reason left to protect the ones who could. None of this made early pregnancy safe. Legal and historical records confirm some girls, especially in elite, politically arranged marriages, did become pregnant at 12, 13, 14, years before their bodies had finished developing. Childbirth was, in fact, the single leading cause of death for young Roman women, and grieving families carved that directly onto tombstones: exact age at death, even which pregnancy it was. One inscription records a wife's 10th birth killing her on its 3rd day of labor. A pregnancy landing on a pelvis that isn't finished growing is a pregnancy landing on hardware that isn't built for the job yet. Obstructed labor, catastrophic tearing, injuries the ancient world had almost no real fix for. Exactly the trauma bioarchaeologists look for on young female skeletons. Because that combination of age markers and pelvic damage tells its own brutal, specific story, written in fracture lines instead of ink. So why did it take civilization thousands of years to close that gap? As late as 1880, most American states set the legal age of consent at 10 or 12. Delaware had it at 7. What actually moved that number wasn't new science about pelvises or grandmothers. It was a deliberate, decades-long political campaign. Starting in 1885, groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, alongside early suffrage activists, ran petition drives state legislature by state legislature year after year against constant pushback. By 1890, several states had pushed the number to 14 or 16. It took until 1920, the same year American women won the right to vote, largely the same activist network fighting both battles, for every U.S. state to finally land between 16 and 18. The UK had already made that move in 1885, a full generation ahead. Biology never changed. People finally decided the law should match it. Trace any of our family trees back far enough, and the odds say you'll eventually hit a mother who hadn't finished being a kid herself, who survived something that killed plenty of women standing in her exact spot. Nobody's arguing that was fine. It's just what the record actually shows, over and over in population after population, right up until 4 separate pressures: chemical, statistical, social, and legal, all finally stopped pointing toward 12 at roughly the same time in history. Ignorance was never really the mechanism. It was 4 systems under enormous strain, quietly deciding an age nobody would pick on purpose if they had any other option. That's the whole reason the kid on their phone right now gets to have this age back. Worrying about a group chat instead of a household.